She's done more. Oh.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Mr.
Jim. Welcome.
Thank you. We do not have any heat, and sometime around 12:30 to 1 o'clock, a heating person is going to come. My wife is here, so it should not interfere at all, but I just thought I should let you know.
Thank you for that. And we're on YouTube, so we'll start in a few minutes.
Hello, Doug Cruz here. Greetings to everyone.
Hey, Doug,
Hey,
very impressive.
we're just trying to make ourselves beautiful, get my hair under control here. Haven't had a haircut since August.
Lisa doesn't cut your hair?
No, no.
Wise man. My wife cut mine.
Just a reminder, the live stream has started. So if you may want to mute yourself and maybe turn off the camera. I think everyone looks good, but we'll start the official event in just a little bit, about 6 minutes or so. Thank you.
Good morning. I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Everybody is ready. Looks like we're here. Excellent.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. Good morning. I'm U.S. Election Assistance Commission Chairman Ben Hovland, and I'd like to welcome all of our speakers today and everyone watching virtually to the EAC Roundtable on the EAC and Rutgers study, Disability and Voting Accessibility in the 2020 Elections and Lessons Learned in Election Accessibility. Around this time last year, we hosted the Elections Disability, Accessibility, and Security Forum in person. Some of the speakers today joined us for that great event, but at this time on the other side of the election, we're excited to look back and see what we learned from 2020 as far as accessibility. And while we aren't in person today, we are excited that we're able to connect virtually and have this important conversation. To start today's discussion, we will hear from Professors Lisa Schur and Doug Cruz from Rutgers University about the findings of the Disability and Voting Accessibility in 2020 Elections study. Thank you very much to Professor Schur and Professor Cruz for your hard work on this important study. In addition to that analysis, we will hear from advocates and stakeholders on what they view as the lessons learned regarding accessibility during the 2020 elections. While 2020 was a unique year with a lot of attention paid to the presidential election, the pandemic continues and elections are still being held in 2021 throughout the country. The lessons from 2020 are critical to remember as election officials continue to administer elections during the pandemic and beyond. Ensuring accessibility for voters with disabilities is a critical piece of the EAC's mission and one of the highest priorities the EAC champions. We continue to partner with election officials, stakeholders, and community advocates to advance access to the ballot for all voters. Our first panel will get into the specifics of the study, but we're pleased to see that voting difficulties among people with disabilities declined markedly from the original study in 2012 to this year, to the 2020 study. Although there are still obstacles for voters with disabilities, we are happy to see that during an especially difficult election year, access to the ballot for voters with disabilities has improved. We're looking forward to not only hearing more from Rutgers about the study findings, but also from our second panel of election officials and disability advocates about their observations and experiences with accessibility in the 2020 election year. We hope that today's roundtable can provide insight on not only the gains that have been made, but also the areas that the EAC should continue to evaluate to best support election officials in the critical mission of ensuring equal access to the ballot for the growing community of voters with disabilities. Thank you to all of our speakers and everyone viewing this discussion online. And now I'd like to turn it over to EAC Vice Chairman Don Palmer for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Hubble, and I appreciate it. And thank you to our speakers today. I'd like to thank my fellow commissioners and the agency leadership for partnering with Rutgers to conduct this study during the 2020 election. I look forward to the presentation of the findings and the panel discussion. I'm hopeful that the panels will provide some insight into the voting experience for people with disabilities and voters without disabilities, what progress has been made since 2012 and how the COVID pandemic affected voting experiences, as well as discussion on the positive work of election officials. It is my hope that this study will inform the EAC on ways that we as an agency can assist local election officials in providing that support to voters with disabilities. Even during one of the most difficult and challenging election years, it is my belief that election officials were able to increase access for voters with disabilities, make polling places more accessible, and provide different options, different voting options. And in fact, one of the findings just going through the study, I find it remarkable that the difficulty in voting seemed to decrease for both voters with disabilities and voters without disabilities across the board. And that in a pandemic year is just remarkable. As we continue the EAC efforts to improve accessibility in elections, I look forward to hearing from today's panelists on the future of election accessibility. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Palmer. Commissioner Hicks, do you have any opening remarks?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. The EAC hosted several accessible events last year and distributed resources for election officials. As election officials were adjusting election processes and communications for the pandemic, they also prioritized access for voters with disabilities. We are encouraged by the response of our election officials and celebrate alongside them in their success as shown through our EAC Accessible in Voting Survey and Study. I look forward to hearing from some of our longtime partners in disability advocacy, as well as some new and innovative successes stories from our election officials. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Commissioner McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Hovland. With accessibility as a constant concern for election officials, much like security, there was much concern about how they would be able to continue prioritizing accessibility during this past election year, while many jurisdictions were having to transition to a large absentee or vote by mail process. As we've heard in the past, for voters with disabilities, paper ballots may be difficult for them for a variety of reasons. So I'm particularly interested in hearing the survey results with regard to vote by mail and absentee ballots. While not always perfect, through dedication to accessibility and collaboration, election officials were able to maintain a high level of access to the ballot for all voters during the primaries and general election. Although there have been some improvements in accessibility for voters with disabilities, we still recognize there's much work to be done, and we're excited to hear from election officials and advocates about where we go from here. We very much rely on and appreciate those who take the time to provide input and comments to us on these issues. Accessibility is and will continue to be a top priority for the Commission. I'd like to thank our speakers, and I look forward to hearing from them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. We'll now turn to our first panel. The comprehensive EAC and Rutgers study analyzed several crucial areas of access in elections for voters with disabilities. For our first panel, we will hear from the researchers who led this effort. Professors Lisa Schur and Doug Cruz are the co-directors of the Rutgers University Program for Disability Research. Thank you for undertaking this important project with the EAC, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. We're honored to be here, and we're very excited to be working with the EAC on this critically important topic. All right, so we want to share our screen here.
Just making sure we can do so. There we go.
All right, so I'm going to start. We're going to do a bit of a tag team presentation. So what were the voting experiences of people with disabilities like in the 2020 elections? And how did they compare to the experiences of voters without disabilities? And how much progress has there been in voting accessibility since 2012? And of course, how did the COVID pandemic affect voting experiences? To answer these and other questions, the EAC asked Rutgers University to design and coordinate a national survey of voting eligible citizens with and without disabilities after the 2020 elections. Our national sample was based on randomly selected citizens eligible to vote in the 2020 elections. The survey was designed to update and expand our earlier 2012 post-election survey that was also funded by the EAC. Both surveys were conducted by SSRS, which is a highly respected survey research firm. The disability measure was based on the 6-question set used by the Census Bureau, plus a 7th broad question designed to capture other types of disabilities. Our total sample of all participants was 2,569. People with disabilities made up 1,782, and people without disabilities, 787. We sampled citizens with disabilities. We oversampled them because we needed to get a large enough sample to make reliable estimates and breakdowns by disability type and demographics. The total sample is more than twice as large as the typical national phone surveys of 1,000 people. So the results should be generalizable well to the disability and non-disability populations. So the full report has 32 detailed statistical tables. I'm not going to go through all of those. All the results use survey weights to reflect the full disability and non-disability populations. The report notes which differences are large enough to be statistically significant that fall outside the survey's margin of error so that we can be highly confident of a true difference in the population. So the following slides highlight some of the key results we found. Disability characteristics. The disability sample reflects the overall US disability population. Almost half, 48% of the people in the disability sample have mobility impairments, 1/4 have cognitive impairments, 1/6 have hearing impairments, 1/8 have vision impairments, 1/4 have difficulty going outside alone, 1/8 have difficulty with self-care inside their homes, and 1/3 need help in activities of daily living. And these categories can overlap. Looking at turnout, people with disabilities voted at a 7% lower rate than people without disabilities of the same age. And this points to a continuing disability gap in voter turnout that we found in past elections. However, there's a caveat. The disability turnout gap may have narrowed in 2020. We will have better sense of this when the Census Bureau's voting and registration supplement data set is released in April. Difficulties in voting. So we're really happy to report that voting difficulties among people with disabilities declined markedly from 2012 to 2020, from 26% to 11%. However, about 1 in 9 voters with disabilities reported having difficulties voting in 2020, and this is double the rate of people without disabilities. Almost half, 49% of the voters with disabilities voted at a polling place in 2020. That's compared to 56% of voters without disabilities. The shift to using mail ballots, excuse me, from 2012 to 2020 was identical to for voters with and without disabilities. It was a 28% point increase, which clearly reflects the influence of the pandemic. One quarter of voters with and without disabilities, 24% and 25%, voted early at a polling place. And close to 3/4 of voters with disabilities voted with a mail ballot or early in person in 2020. And this shows a significant increase from 2012 and is higher than the 2/3 of non-disabled voters who did so in 2020. Difficulties that people experience voting in person. Among people with disabilities who did vote in person in 2020, 18 reported difficulties compared to 10% of people without disabilities. And this disability number is down from 30% in 2012. The difficulties were most common among people with vision and cognitive impairments, 30% and 24% respectively. And now I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
Thanks. I'm also very, very happy to be part of this. We're very happy to work with the EAC. So I'll take it from here. There's obviously good news that the level of difficulties experienced by people with disabilities decreased from 2012 to 2020. But a big question is how much of that is due to the shift to mail voting, voting by mail. We estimate that about half of the decline in difficulties voting at a polling place for people with disabilities appears due to progress, actual progress in making polling places more accessible. The biggest declines in difficulty were in difficulty reading or seeing the ballot and difficulty understanding how to vote or use the voting equipment. And those two things are very much under the control of election officials and polling place workers. So we think that indicates good progress. There were possible declines in difficulty in finding or getting to the polling place and waiting in line, but those declines were within the survey's margin of error, so we can't be highly confident. The other half of the overall decline is tied to a change in the composition of polling place voters, as those expecting the most difficulties switch to mail ballots. Basically, if you have a severe disability and you expect difficulties in voting at a polling place, you're much more likely to switch to voting by mail as mail voting became more easy in 2020. So that's about half of the decline. There are problems in voting with a mail ballot as well. We found that among those using mail ballots, 5% of voters with disabilities had difficulty using the ballot, compared to 2% of voters without disabilities. The big problem, and the bar that really sticks out here, as you can see, is for people with vision impairments. 22% of voters with vision impairments had difficulties with the mail ballot. We also measured the need for assistance and found that among voters with disabilities, 6% of in-person voters needed assistance and 11% of mail voters needed assistance. We combined these assistance and difficulty measures to come up with a measure of how many people were able to vote independently, that is without assistance, without difficulties. And we found that 5 of 6 voters with a disability, 83%, voted independently without difficulties in 2020, compared to over 9 of 10, 92% of voters without disabilities. We found also that among those using mail ballot, 1 in 7 of voters with disabilities using the mail ballot either needed assistance or encountered difficulties in voting, compared to only 3% of those without disabilities. One measure we had was of election officials, the perceived respect from election officials. We found that among in-person voters, people with disabilities were actually more likely to report that election officials were very respectful toward them, 84% compared to 77% for people without disabilities. There was a slightly negative note that the perceived respect from election officials appeared to decline slightly from 2012 for voters both with and without disabilities. And we speculate this could be possibly due to the stresses of the pandemic this past year. Another measure we included in the survey was confidence that your vote was accurately counted. We found 2/3, 68% of voters with disabilities said they were highly confident the vote was accurately counted. And that's actually significantly more than the 59% of voters without disabilities who said so. Close to 1/8, or 13% of each group, said they are not very confident or not at all confident the vote was accurately counted. And interestingly, the results were very similar for in-person and mail voters. We also took this opportunity, we asked another question of voters this year, last year, in 2020. We asked them to compare their voting experience in 2020 to the last time they voted before the pandemic. Was it easier or more difficult? Overall, most voters with and without disabilities, 63% and 64%, almost 2/3, said it was about the same. But mail voting seemed to help. Among those who voted in person before the pandemic, but with a mail ballot in 2020, close to half of voters said it was easier in 2020. 50% of voters with disabilities, 53% of voters without disabilities. Another interesting measure was among those who voted in polling places both in 2020 and pre-pandemic. We found that 1/4 of voters with disabilities who did so, voted in polling places both times, said it was easier in 2020 compared to only 13% of voters without disabilities. And that provides some more evidence of increased accessibility. It reinforces what Lisa was saying, that there seems to have been a decrease in difficulties voting in polling places, and that's validated in part by the direct reports of people with disabilities. 23% of them saying it was easier this year than it was before. Another question we asked was how people would prefer to vote in the next election. If you wanted to vote in the next election, how would you prefer to cast your vote? We gave 5 options and we rotated the options. We found that close to half, 49% of people with disabilities, and 3/5, 61% of people without disabilities would prefer voting in person inside a polling place. So that continues to be powerfully attractive. The next most popular was voting with a mail ballot, chosen by 1/3 of people with disabilities, 32%, and 1/5 of people without disabilities, 19%. Among the other 3 options, the choice among the remaining options did not differ significantly by disability. About 1/8, 12 to 14%, chose voting fully online by personal computer or smartphone. Between 4 and 5% chose filling out a ballot online and then printing and mailing it, also known as electronic ballot delivery. And 3% chose voting by drive-through or curbside. So we have a lot of other measures, and as Lisa said, we have 32 detailed statistical tables there, plenty of numbers that people can go through. Just a quick overview here of some of the other topics we cover in the report. We look at the relationship of disability to non-voting forms of political participation. Did people work for candidates? Did they contribute to candidates? Did they contribute to political organizations? Did they take part in a protest or demonstration? So we look at that. We also look at political interest. How much did people follow politics? Feelings of political efficacy. Did they feel capable of participating, and did they see the system as responsive? We asked about recruitment for voting. Did people ask, were people asked by anyone about whether they would vote or not? Did anyone talk to them? And then we look at other facilitators of voting, which we've explored and other political scientists have explored in past research. These tend to be important predictors: employment, group involvement, transportation, attending religious services, education, and income. So those are some of the other topics. We're glad to go into any of those with any of you. Conclusion, the key takeaways: voting accessibility for people with disabilities has improved since 2012. Despite the progress, however, 1 in 9 people with disabilities do encounter difficulties in voting, and they are twice as likely as those without disabilities to experience these difficulties, which points to the need for continued progress in improving accessibility and ensuring people with disabilities can easily exercise the right to vote. As I say, we welcome any questions, and we welcome the opportunity to make these results as useful as possible for improving civic participation and access to voting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schur and Cruz. We'll now do a series of questions. I'll kick it off, and then we'll rotate in the order that we gave our opening statements, sort of one at a time. And so, one of the things I really wanted to hit on, or I appreciated in the study, the EAC was established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002, or HAVA. And part of that bill was aiming to ensure that all Americans had the ability to vote independently and privately. And I found part of your findings to be very encouraging in the improvement we've seen since 2012. But also, obviously, there's a lot of work to be done. And so, I took out of that, it sounds like there's several points that note that polling place accessibility is improving, but I hope that you could talk a little bit more about what you saw from the study about both the progress that's been made, but also some of the really outstanding challenges that we need to address.
Want to, Chris?
Sure, it's obviously a good question. We don't have data on voting problems going back to 2002.
Right.
And of course, we wish we did. Our data, as we talked about, comparing 2012 and 2020, show that there has been good progress, but there is still this challenge that voters with disabilities are still about twice as likely to have difficulties voting as voters without disabilities. We suspect that problem was even greater in 2002, given the trends we see in these two surveys we've done. There are we do think that there's a particular concern with people who have vision or cognitive impairments. They express the most difficulties, and that's something that's not solved by voting by mail for people with vision impairments in particular. The ability for them to vote confidentially and independently is it's impossible for people who are fully blind. And for those voting by mail, electronic ballot delivery, we think has a lot of potential, where you can fill out the ballot online on the computer, print it out and mail it, and nobody else has to know how you voted. In addition, there are other new technologies, as I know you're aware, that are being developed that can make it easier to vote privately and independently. So there has been progress, but there's plenty more progress to be made.
Thank you for that, Vice Chair Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the findings that struck me was the popularity of in-person voting with voters with disabilities and voters without disabilities, and sort of the challenge of those with visual impairment in sort of the vote by mail process. And however, in this cycle with the pandemic, both the primaries and the general election, many states did try or did expand voting options such as electronic ballot delivery and marking for mail and absentee balloting. What were some of your findings in this area? Were these popular options in the states that implemented that accessible absentee voting, or were voters generally aware of these options that might be available to them? Thank you.
Well, when we asked people how they would prefer to vote in the next election, 4 to 5% had mentioned electronic ballot delivery. So it seems that it's very likely that a lot of people aren't aware of this option. So we think that there's probably more work that needs to be done, not only to make it available, but also to educate people about this as an option. So that's definitely one thing. I do want to just emphasize something Doug said about the importance of voting in person, though, at polling places. As he mentioned, we conducted some focus groups before the survey, and a number of people talked about the importance of voting in person and showing up as someone with a disability with the fellow citizens, that this was extremely important to them to be seen voting together and not separate. So I think we need to pay attention to that as well going forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. An old friend of the EAC, Doug Lewis, always talked about the fact that if you live long enough, you will have some form of a disability. Professor Cruz and Shore, thank you for the study. Demographics have shown an increased number of older Americans who will eventually require accessible assistance. Can you derive from your report about the aging electorate and the implementation of accessibility in general?
I can take this one.
Sure.
So we didn't study older voters specifically, But clearly voters with disabilities do tend to be older than those without disabilities. And clearly as the population ages, there will be more citizens with disabilities in the United States. And what this does, obviously, it points to a great and increasing importance of voting accessibility. So in addition, many older voters who won't necessarily identify as having a disability can still benefit from greater accessibility in polling places and other forms, such as being able to get into a polling place without steps, for example, could benefit a lot of older people who might have difficulty climbing stairs, but don't think of themselves as having a disability. So we think that these policies that make voting easier for people with disabilities also will have benefits in general for much broader groups.
McCormick.
Thank you, Chair Hovland, and thank you so much for partnering with the EAC on this survey. It's very informative. Why do you think the increase in vote by mail and absentee voting in the 2020 elections led to a decrease in voting difficulties for voters with disabilities?
Sure. The voting by mail poses fewer problems for people with disabilities, and I think people without disabilities. You don't have the problem with voting by mail. You don't have the problem of finding and getting into the polling place, which can be a problem for many people with disabilities. You don't have the problem of operating the voting equipment, which may pose some difficulties for people with limited finger dexterity or whatever kind of problem. So there are problems that are posed by polling places that aren't posed by voting in mail, by mail. Now, voting by mail can pose extra problems for people with vision impairments, as we talked about. But in general, voting by mail is easier for most people. So that's why we think that, as we indicated, that accounts for some of the improvement in 2020, but not all of the improvement. There is still improvement. Just looking at people who voted in polling places, there is improvement from 2012.
Thank you so much.
Circling back, I mean, again, thinking about the work that you've done on this over time, both this study, but your past work, are there any real trends that stand out, both positive or negative? Either are things that you can definitely see market improvement on, or things that stubbornly we just haven't gotten there on yet.
Do you want to?
Why don't I start it? And then
Sure.
So one thing we've seen, and as I said, we don't have the definitive numbers on turnout at this point. We will in April when the census data comes out. But there has been a stubborn turnout gap that we've seen through decades, and we're hoping that making it easier this time we might be seeing a decrease in the gap, but that's one of the persistent problems that we've noticed throughout our different studies that we've looked at, ones we've conducted ourselves as well as others that we've studied.
Yeah, and I guess to your question, you ask about progress and challenges. One of the big challenges, as Lisa said, is that there is this stubborn disability turnout gap. It may have decreased last year. Our findings point to a decrease, but we won't be very confident about that until the census data come out. So that's a challenge. But the progress, as we've talked about, we certainly seem to see an improvement in polling place accessibility. All the signs point to that. So that's tremendously important, and the increased access of vote by mail is also a positive thing.
And one more thing we've noticed is in terms of political efficacy, the feeling or the belief that one is capable and competent to participate. We've seen people with disabilities increasingly say that they feel competent to participate. And that's an important predictor of voting. So that's a good sign.
Well, and I should note as well, another really interesting result. I mentioned that we asked about political interest and, and efficacy. Another result in our report is that back in 2012, people with disabilities actually expressed a bit less political interest than people without disabilities. This in 2020, though, that flipped. People with disabilities actually expressed more interest in politics. They said they followed politics more closely than did people without disabilities. So that increase in political interest among people with disabilities, and as Lisa said, the increased political efficacy, the feeling that you're able to participate in politics, are both very positive signs for the future.
I think so. And if I could just go back to that for 1 second, I think that also ties in with the fact that people had less trouble reading or understanding how to vote, reading the ballot or understanding how to vote. And I think as those problems go down, people feel more competent to participate. So I think those are tied together.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Vice Chair Palmer.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, there seems to be some encouraging news from the study. And that there's progress being made on improving access for voters with disabilities. Are there a few actionable items or fundamental takeaways we can take away, not only the EAC, but perhaps other policymakers on ways to improve? We take this very seriously with the accessible provisions inside HAVA, but there's also other stakeholders. So what can we take away from this survey?
Well, we're not policymakers, but we can point to some of the biggest problems we see and things that need to be addressed. So I'll just highlight three issues here. The biggest voting problems, again, are experienced by people with vision and cognitive impairments, such as reading the ballot or understanding how to vote. And these are problems both for voting at polling places and for people who are voting by mail. So continued attention to the physical accessibility of ballots and understanding how to vote, that's highly important. For example, ensuring plain language on ballots could be very helpful, I believe. Do you want to?
Sure. And as Lisa said, we're not policymakers, but of course we think about this and want to contribute to good policy on this. A second point is that, as we talked about, polling places are still important. It might be tempting from the vast, the great expansion, the 28-point expansion in mail ballots last year, to think, well, that's the future. We should just all vote by mail in the future. And obviously some states do that. But given the large number of people with and without disabilities who say they would prefer voting in at a polling place, we think that that has to be part of the that has to be maintained, I guess. This most obviously, that, as Lisa said, we found several people in our focus groups who spoke quite eloquently about their desire to be seen voting in public with their fellow citizens. And I guess the last thing we'll just say about this in terms of policy options, and this is kind of obvious, voting needs to be made as easy as possible. So more options are a good thing. Yep. Having options like electronic ballot delivery, having the drop boxes this past year, having lots of different ways to vote helps improve voter turnout. And voters obviously need to be made aware of all the voting options, like electronic ballot delivery that's already available in about half the states. So we'd put emphasis not only on increasing the options, but also continuing the efforts that, of course, I know EAC and election officials already do to expand knowledge of those options.
Thank you. Commissioner Hicks.
Thank you. I think it's amazing for folks to want to be seen voting at a polling place, but I also think it's encouraging if, I know you're not policymakers, but to survey folks on serving as poll workers with disabilities, because I think that that's an added feature that people can get behind. My question goes to the 2,500 folks that you surveyed. I'm assuming, not being a statistician or someone who can do this sort of stuff, that it was statistically done across the country. So, but how was that done in terms of the 5 states that do vote by mail? Did you see a significant lower percentage of folks who were against voting by mail, who have visual impairments in those states, basically Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii? Or was that not taken into account because you just randomly surveyed people?
That's a really good question. And we do have state coded up in the data set, but we've not done breakdowns by state yet, basically because the sample is so, the sample gets so small.
Yeah.
Now we can cluster together several states, and one of the first things I'll do after this is to look at those 5 states and see if we can cluster them together and get a big enough sample for some meaningful analysis. We're kind of waiting on the Census Bureau data in April to have much larger sample to be able to look at the relative turnout in those states and other states. But that's a really good question. Yeah, our sample, as you say, of over 2,600 is very good for, and it's above the standard sample size for reaching meaningful conclusions about the nation as a whole. We do have that state level data that we will use in further analysis, and we look forward to pursuing any questions on doing state comparisons that you and others have to suggest.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, this year was kind of an unusual year with the COVID-19 pandemic, and wondering how that impacted your survey. And then what were some of the notable facets of this election for people with disabilities because of COVID-19?
Well, do you?
Right, so we saw clearly a large shift to voting by mail by people with and without disabilities. This was especially important for people with disabilities who might have been at greater risk for COVID if they voted in person, who had underlying conditions or were otherwise compromised in terms of their immune systems. Many states made it easier to do this. And that was very likely a major factor in the lower rate of voting difficulties that we mentioned. And actually, as we said, voting difficulties were down during the pandemic compared to 2012 for people with disabilities. And that's really a testament to the efforts of election officials and polling place workers during this really incredibly challenging time. And despite the challenges, I mean, a majority of voters said poll workers treated them with respect, and people with disabilities were actually more likely than those without disabilities to say that poll workers treated them with respect. Now, granted, these numbers are slightly down from 2012, but I think given the challenges and given the difficulties, that's still a good result. And the fact that most voters said that voting in 2020 was easier or no more difficult than it had been before the pandemic is also a really good finding. So those you want to add?
Well, I was just going to add there that going into this survey, we really didn't know what to expect.
Right, we had no preconceived ideas.
With the pandemic last year creating a lot of chaos in a lot of places, we thought, boy, there's a good chance that voting difficulties will be up this year. So we were very, pleasantly surprised by the results. It was. I'm always happy to learn something from the data, learn something that I didn't expect, and quite honestly, we were a little fearful that the results might go the other way.
Yeah, but we did not come in with assumptions one way or the other. It
Yeah,
was like, let's just see what the data show us.
What do the numbers show
Yeah.
us?
Yeah, it'll be interesting the next time we do a survey like this to
Yep.
see what impact this year had on those results.
Oh, very
Right,
much, yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you.
I want to be mindful of our time, and I don't think we quite have enough time to do another full round. So I thought maybe we'd wrap up here by just giving you the opportunity. I mean, you just mentioned being a little surprised by the results. Were there anything else that we didn't hit on, or that you saw that stood out, or always that ability to have hindsight, what you wish you would have said. So just sort of final thoughts on the study or what you saw here as it relates to voters with disabilities in the 2020 election. Would welcome any closing thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have reason for optimism, although I don't think that we should be complacent about this, because again, 1 in 9 voters with disabilities still have problems. We didn't go into any racial disparities in this talk, but I think, if you look at waiting times between white voters with disabilities and Black voters with disabilities waited twice as long, 45 minutes to vote. And those kind of disparities need to be addressed as well. So.
Yeah, we're not, usually after I do a survey, I think, oh boy, if we only asked this.
Yeah.
and we don't have any feelings like that right now, that, oh, if we only asked this question. We think we covered we think we covered things pretty well. And we're going to be very interested to analyze these data more, with spurred in part by questions from all of you. In particular, looking at influences of looking at the facilitators of voting.
Yeah.
That I mentioned, employment, group involvement, and so forth. Employment is a biggie.
Yeah.
That's something we've done a lot of research on separately from voting, is disability and employment. People with disabilities have very low employment levels, and employment is such an important factor. We find that the employment levels of, the voting levels of people, of employed people with and without disabilities are about the same. But there's a big gap between people with and without disabilities who are not employed. So I just pose that as an example of the of the kind of further research we're going to do here, and we will also be, of course, analyzing these data a lot to see what more they can teach us, and we'll be submitting this to some journals, as well. You can be sure of that. We're good academics.
And I could talk about this for hours, but let me just say one more thing, and that is that isolation is a major problem for a lot of people with disabilities. A lot of people with disabilities live alone and they're socially isolated. And we found that people who have contact, who participate in groups, who attend religious services, are more likely to vote as well. So efforts to reach out, to recruit people with disabilities, to engage them in organizations and groups are all positive, both in terms of the quality of life and social participation, as well as in voting participation.
Well, thank you for that, and for all of your work on this important issue, and for working with us. Really, interesting stuff, and I'm glad that this was able to happen. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Palmer to introduce our second panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I'm going to introduce the second panel now. First, we have Heidi Burhans, who's the Director of Elections in Iowa. We also have Michelle Bishop. She's the Voter Access and Engagement Manager with the National Disability Rights Network. And we have Jim Dixon, who's with the National Council on Independent Living. Thank you all for being on this second panel. I'm going to start off the question with a general question. I hope you all can weigh in, and then we'll go down the row here, the commissioners. I guess the first thing I would ask is, our first panel detailed key findings from the EAC and Rutgers Disability and Accessibility Study, and you had the opportunity to read it and listen to it a bit. How can we harness those findings to help voters with disabilities and the election officials who serve them? And what can EAC take away from that to assist state and local election officials? Let's start with Michelle. Why don't we start with you, Michelle, and then we'll just go down the line with Heidi and then Jim.
Sure, happy to. Well, I think something that's really fascinating about these findings are all the ways we've seen barriers broken down in terms of different avenues to the vote, right? That the number of people who voted by mail and who found that easier, to me, is really surprising. Vote by mail, typically, we think of vote by mail as easier because it eliminates some of the challenges we think of, right? If I use a wheelchair and my polling place doesn't have a ramp, then that doesn't work for me. But I can just vote by mail. But voting by mail traditionally is really inaccessible to people with disabilities. Mailing someone a piece of paper that they can't necessarily read or handle doesn't make the process more accessible. And I think something we did in 2020 because of the pandemic, probably more so than because of voters with disabilities that are around all the time, we expanded some of those options. We added drop boxes in a lot of places. We added electronic ballot delivery in a number of states. We took down some of those barriers that are there all the time that we probably don't need, like notary requirements and witness signature requirements. We extended deadlines. We made it, in some states, they got rid of having an excuse for why you want to vote by mail versus going to your polling place. We took down some of those barriers and we really opened up the process to voters, and that benefits everyone, but it really, really benefits voters with disabilities. So I think we made some really positive changes in how we run our elections, and that doesn't have to be a COVID thing. Those can be some good things that we keep when we are hopefully someday out of this pandemic. So I think we have to really think about what we did right and really harness that. Even outside of vote by mail, in a lot of places, they opened up their curbside voting. I think that was very smart during a pandemic, I've got to say, because there were absolutely people who tested positive for COVID-19 after the deadline to get an absentee ballot, who had to make the choice between forfeiting their right to vote or showing up at a polling place and potentially infecting other people. If you had the ability to keep them in their car and have just a couple poll workers approach them with PPE the exact same way we do COVID testing, that was a really smart decision on your part. But it also benefits people with disabilities, either because they're immunocompromised or because the polling place is just inaccessible, the reason we usually use curbside voting in some other jurisdictions. So we made some really smart decisions that really open up options for voters. And I think going forward, we want to continue to harness those and make them better. I loved the addition of drop boxes. I voted by drop box in 2020. It was so much easier. It doesn't work for everyone, but it really works for some. And I think it's worth it for the folks that it works for. But we did see some drop boxes that were not accessible. They weren't placed well, or they weren't designed to be ADA compliant. A lot of them were done on the fly, so I think we can understand why that happens. But I'd love to see us keep using drop boxes as an option going forward in our menu of options for voters, but maybe improving them. And that's something we'd love to help with, or we'd love to see the EAC maybe issue some guidelines or best practices around that. We'd really love to see the Department of Justice maybe put out some guidelines the same way they do for polling places to make our drop boxes better. So I think we have to take away the things that we did really well in 2020 to break down barriers when we really had to because of this pandemic and make them long-term solutions.
Jim, what are your thoughts and general findings on the study?
Well, first, I think we should all thank both election officials and the disability rights organizations who worked very hard to communicate and let people know that this time out we had many more options for voting, as Michelle just said. I would add extended early voting seems to be significant. A lot of people with disabilities voted that way. I did notice in the data, there's been a lot of improvement, and the EAC should be thanked for providing the funds for the study. It's always wonderful to see measured improvement. But I am very troubled by the persistence of the voter participation gap And I do think that the fact that we still see double the number of problems for voters with disabilities has to be a factor in that low turnout. If somebody has trouble voting, are they going to come back the next time, particularly in a pandemic? I had trouble. If I go, I'm going to have trouble again. There's a pandemic. Maybe I shouldn't go. There's one other data point that wasn't mentioned that really leaped out at me, if I read it correctly. And that is that the voter participation gap between seniors with disabilities and seniors without disabilities seems to be significant. And I think we have to look at why that is. The other patterns in life are when you're a senior, you're more likely to vote. Why is it that we didn't see, we see a drop off if you acquire a disability as you age, and what can be done to improve that? But big thanks to election officials for their hard work. They really are the guardian angels of our democracy.
Director Burns, what's your opinion on the findings and what do you take away from them?
Well, I think that both Michelle and Jim make excellent points, as did the professors Schur and Cruz. And I think that education is so incredibly important, and we have to continue to develop and nurture collaborative efforts between election officials and advocacy groups to bring information to the voters, but also the legislators. In this country, each state has their own set of election laws and rules. Yep. And sometimes the legislators may not be fully aware of all the challenges that voters may face in accessing ballots. And over the last 2 years, including this year, we have proposed legislation or language requesting authority to pilot technology here in Iowa to be able to electronically transmit ballots to voters with disabilities. And we have conversations ongoing with advocacy groups here in Iowa, asking them also to discuss with the legislators so that the legislators can have well-rounded information and also, of course, hear from the voters. But the education goes beyond just making sure the voters understand the elections, the key dates and times, the when, where, how they can access ballots, but also making sure that they understand when there are those smaller local elections. The city and school elections have a far greater impact on their daily lives than the presidential election may have. And so making sure that they understand all of the election opportunities in their community, but then also working very closely with the local election officials here in Iowa. Those would be the county commissioners of elections and those precinct election officials. We want everyone to understand, why is there accessible equipment? Why is it there? Why does it need to be accessible? But also how to understand operating the equipment, setting it up, but then also looking at the polling place and being able to recognize that they might not have it in the best location possible. There are so many different levels that we have to continue to improve our education capabilities.
Thank you. Commissioner Hovland, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Palmer. Director Burns, I'll start with you on this one, but would love to get feedback too from Ms. Bishop and Mr. Dixon. Obviously, you all have been doing a lot of great work in Iowa to try to expand accessibility and people's access to the right to vote. You know, in the last panel, we heard a lot of survey data, again, parts of it encouraging, parts of it telling us there's work to do. So from Director Burns, I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing in Iowa to ensure that Iowans are able to vote. And then for Ms. Bishop and Mr. Dixon, if there are individual state or local examples that stand out to you as models or great examples of innovation in this space where election officials are helping their voters participate, would love to hear about those as well.
So a few years ago in Iowa, we developed some training videos for the precinct election officials that took them through how to turn on and operate every version of accessible equipment utilized here in Iowa. And we continue to work with the county commissioners to determine their additional needs for the precinct election official training. And so those videos are continuing to be revamped and enhanced. And last year, we also started working with the Disability Rights Iowa, starting to collaborate on additional disability etiquette training that we can provide to the precinct election officials. And then around the same time that we developed those videos, we also developed tablets that we sent to each of the county commissioners, 99 of them, that help them with ensuring that their polling places meet ADA accessibility requirements. So the tablet has specific software on there in which they can make notes. They have measurement guidelines, so they can go to each polling place and review everything about the polling place, the outside accessibility, the entrances, and then inside the area they're going to use for setup. And then it also allows them to take photographs and make additional notes if they need to discuss with the building management making improvements to maybe alleviate some concerns that could be in voters' ways as they're accessing the ballot. We also then specifically last year, for the first time ever, did a statewide mailing of absentee ballot request forms for both the primary and general elections. And that certainly played a role in increasing our turnout. In Iowa, we had record turnout and record absentee voting for both our primary, which was in June, and then the general election. And then also we mailed voter guides to all of the active registered voters that detailed their options for safe voting during the pandemic and outlined how they could access a ballot if they wanted to vote from home, if they wanted to vote absentee in person, or if they wanted to vote in the polling place on election day. And that information included how they could find their polling place, how they could find their county commissioner's office or their satellite locations, as well as the types of PPE that would be available and in use at all of those locations. So we had worked with our state Homeland Security to provide PPE to all 99 counties. The commissioners and their staff could use it during the in-person voting and at satellite locations. And then they provide it to their precinct election officials. And they also had extra PPE available in each polling place for voters. So they could utilize gloves, masks, hand sanitizer as they needed. Then we also worked with Disability Rights Iowa and developed a quick check tool that is a brochure, basically, that when you unfold it, it is 3 feet long. And that was so that at the bottom of the inside, it could be used as a slope measurement tool, the 1 to 12 inch ratio. And then in that brochure, it focused on the 3 different areas: the outside accessibility, the entrances, and then the inside. And it covered a lot of different pieces. Like on the inside, it even makes, it points out the importance of making sure if you have any signs hanging, how you need to have them higher than you might think. Or if you have a couple of chairs seated near a table, but you need to make sure that there's room for people to pass through those chairs. And then it included notes about why these measurements and these parameters and requirements are important. And so we provided these to every single one of the 1,700 precincts in Iowa so that the precinct election officials, upon setup in the morning, could pull this out to double check that they had enough space for parking outside, and that the entrance to the polling place was accessible, and then inside, and it just walks them through all the areas that they can quickly check. And that really proved to be a very useful tool as well. I could go on and on.
That's great. You've clearly been very busy in Iowa. And so, and I could certainly tell from Ms. Bishop's reactions that some of those, she was a big fan of some of those, Ms. Bishop, if you want to tell us about a few other things that you've seen around the country that you make a difference for voters.
Sure. I think overall, I love when I see elections officials innovate and try new things. I know that can be scary, but it also can make all the difference. And I think a lot of times when we talk about innovation, we talk about, Dean Logan in LA County developing a whole new voting system to attempt to meet the needs of all stakeholders. That's amazing. I'm a fan of that project, right? I think VSAP is very promising, but I think a lot of our elections officials look at that and say, I don't have the resources to do that, right? There are so many elections officials that are like, I am a county clerk. It's me and a part-time assistant. And I'm also in charge of birth and death certificates and marriage licenses and cattle branding and 20 other things, right? I can't make my own voting system, but you don't have to innovate. So many of the things we just heard about are reasonably low budget solutions. I love this thing that folds out to 3 feet and you can use it to measure a slope. Love it. But the most important thing that I heard there, or my favorite thing that I heard there, was we worked with Disability Rights Iowa. Now it's a little bit selfish because Disability Rights Iowa is part of NDRN's national network. So that makes me very happy. I feel like my job is done today, right? But both the organizations that Jim and I represent, NDRN and Nickel, are national networks. So wherever you are, we have an organization in your state or maybe even in your county that want to work with you to help create innovative solutions to some of your accessibility problems. I think the single most important thing you can do as an elections official who's grappling with how to make our elections more accessible would be to reach out to disability rights organizations and voters with disabilities and ask them, what are the challenges you're facing and how can we come up with some solutions for that, and involve people with disabilities in the process. And I think that that is something that we're sometimes missing from our innovation, really including the voices of people with disabilities who we know elections officials. I was so glad Jim thanked elections officials. Oh my gosh, 2020 was a tough year, and I can't believe how well our elections officials did at managing the process, especially the count when usually no one's watching them anymore. That was amazing. Kudos to all of our elections officials. But I think it often feels like, I'm out here on my own trying to make elections better and make sure everyone can vote and solve all these problems. And you really don't have to do it on your own. Nobody knows more than our elections officials about how to run elections and all the minutia that go into that. But that doesn't mean that you also have to be an expert on the ADA and what voters with disabilities need. You can just ask us. And that's the thing that we know better than anybody else. And we're happy to bring that to you. So I just think really that those processes that are really transparent and inclusive are really what drives some of our better innovations, whether or not there's something really big and expensive and sophisticated like a whole new voting system, or something as simple and brilliant as something that folds out to 3 feet and lets you measure a slope.
Great, thank you for that. And Mr. Dixon, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add, any standout examples that you're aware of that have really made a difference for voters?
There are several, but first I would love to get a sample of that 3-foot fold out. I think that's brilliant. And I would love to see that and be able to have it set so that we could send it out as an example to our members across the country. There are a number of states and counties that successfully and securely addressed electronic ballot return. Kudos to the Secretary of State in West Virginia, who offered that not only to voters with disabilities, but to overseas and our men and women who are protecting us. well, it's not directly a disability issue. It is a problem in this country that the rate of not getting, if you are defending us overseas and you send your ballot in snail mail paper, there is a distressingly high rate of those votes that do not get counted. And if more states would offer to the men and women who are protecting us, as well as people with disabilities, the ability to return the ballot electronically, that would be a big help. And there were counties in Utah, in North Carolina, legislation just passed in Massachusetts to help make this happen. And kudos to the American Council of the Blind and the National Federation of the Blind for working with local officials. I would echo Michelle's major point. We have disability organizations in every county in this country, and we now have a national coalition of more than 22 national disability organizations, and we meet weekly to address improving accessibility. And so I would encourage election officials to reach out to any disability organization in their county. Thank you again to the EAC for doing this survey, for funding it. I would ask that you consider funding a similar survey in 2 years. The off-year electorate is a different electorate than the presidential electorate. It presents a different set of issues for election officials. And I think it would be really useful if we could get this data every 2 years. And I'm hopeful we would see a steady improvement.
I have to very quickly second that. In our experience, access is very much a moving target. There's never a point at which you say, perfect, we've solved all of our accessibility issues and now nothing will ever go wrong again, right? Polling places change. Either we move them or they deteriorate, or sometimes they get foreclosed on, right? That happened, I think, in like 2018, the night before an election. So it's constantly changing, and our voters are constantly changing. There's never a point at which we're done. We have to have reliable data that's tracking this information over time so we know where we're making progress and where we need to focus our efforts going forward. That would be phenomenally useful.
Thank you all for that.
Tom, did you have some questions? Commissioner Hicks.
Yes, thank you. There are so many questions I want to ask. The question that is most on my mind, Ms. Bishop, you brought up a little bit about people having immunocompromise when they're going to the polls. And we heard from the last panel how so many folks want to go to the polls. And the EAC, basically, we gave out $400 million last year for PPE and getting and helping with COVID-19. And we heard from states saying that wasn't enough. But can you talk a little bit about how, and anyone else, how folks who have disabilities, are immunocompromised, wanting to express their rights to vote, and how they could do that safely, and some of the things that your organization did to ensure that they were able to do this safely?
Sure. I mean, I think that something that Doug and Lisa pointed out in their presentation that's really important is that all voters are different, and what makes it work for the most voters is a range of options for casting your ballot. There's never going to be one fix all. And we saw that a lot in 2020. For some voters, if you are immunosuppressed, the single most important thing might have been limiting your exposure to COVID-19, whether or not that meant voting by mail or voting curbside. For some voters, that machine in the polling place is what makes voting accessible to you, and that still being available despite the pandemic was the most important thing. And you and the poll workers having that PPE and being prepared for that was what made it work. For some people who live in more remote areas where maybe it's difficult to get to the polling place, that drop box was the thing that made it work, and also limits your exposure, right? There isn't one fix all for any type of voter. I think we have to consistently offer a range of options so that it's going to work for all different types of voters. Early voting, Jim mentioned that, I think was critically important. That really limited the number of people who were potentially moving in and out of a polling place at any given time, or shortened lines that were already very long, because not only do we have historic turnout, but we had to space them out by 6 feet. What a monumental challenge that is. I think we have to continue offering a range of options to voters. We have to expand those options. And the thing we really have to be diligent about is making sure that under the law, every option that's available to a voter has to be accessible to all voters. So the thing we cannot do that I think we really saw a spotlight on in 2020 is say, my polling places are not ADA accessible, but you can vote by mail. Or if my vote by mail is not accessible, but you can go and vote in person. And I think 2020 was the time where it said, well, you know, your vote by mail is not accessible and you said they can vote in person, but now there's a pandemic and that person is high risk for COVID. So that's not good enough. Your vote by mail and your in-person options all have to be accessible to any type of voter. That there really is where the law lies. And I think we've let that slide a little bit too long. And we really have to start addressing that, I think, for every option that a voter has.
I would add to that, if I may, when it comes to the accessibility of that equipment, we already know that the data has shown that there's still many voters, and we expect that to continue, who want to go to the polling place because they believe it's important to vote in person, or they want to be there with their peers and neighbors and fellow community members voting on the same ballot. And then there are people for whom that accessible equipment is their option. They have to have that. And last year in Iowa, we had some county commissioners who got very creative with the curbside voting during our absentee voting period. We have absentee voting for 29 days leading up to the election. And during that time, curbside voting is available. And some county commissioners set up drive-through voting, and they made a point to have 2 different lines. So they could have a line for people who were driving through and marking the ballot by hand. And then they had a line for people who need to use the accessible equipment, and they could still drive through. But when it came to election day, then voters are going to the polling place. The curbside voting is still available, but it's not as easy then, or it's not available for the precinct election officials to move that accessible equipment outside, to have that out there. And, you know, they were trying to make the accessible equipment readily available, easy to clean and wipe down as they were cleaning the other voting booths between each voter, but without wanting to completely separate it from all other voters, because it shouldn't be about having to distance or single out one type of voter from another. So I think that it would be really good if we could look at developing some type of accessible equipment that's very easy for election officials to transport from inside to outside, to have handy. And I know that, you know, with that comes a greater cost, and it's not always easy for local election officials or state election officials to find the money for additional equipment. But if we could start investing some time and resources to exploring that idea to see what we can find as compact and easy, so it's still easy for the voter to use, but easy for the voter to pull into their vehicle, even, so that they're still able to preserve their privacy and independence. And even going along with curbside voting, you know, it's so important to have the additional signs that help precinct election officials or those local election officials designate additional spaces for people who are needing to maybe spend a little more time voting.
The independent living centers and other disability organizations have every year said to Congress, we need to get more money to the states and counties to improve access and to improve safety when it comes to COVID. And we will continue to do that. I do have to raise an issue that is of major concern to the entire disability community. And it speaks to what the commissioner just spoke to about the need to improve the equipment. We are very distressed about the recently adopted voting system guidelines. They are inconsistent. They say you have to be accessible, but they also require you can't digitize something. And if you can't digitize it, you can't be accessible. And I cannot state strongly enough that our view is that this latest iteration of the voting system guidelines is going to set accessibility back. It's not going to address the point that the commissioner just raised about making the systems more portable.
Thank you.
Commissioner McCormick, did you have a question or two?
Sure. This question's for Jim and Michelle, but Ms. Burns, please feel free to weigh in if you want. The accessibility survey showed several areas where visually impaired voters and those with cognitive challenges are still encountering voting problems. What are your thoughts on how policymakers and the EAC can address this divide?
I think we need more experiments with electronic ballot transmittal. I should be able to receive the ballot on my phone, mark it, and send it back. Very, very large numbers of blind persons and people with cognitive disabilities don't have printers. I'm blind. On 2 occasions, I thought my printer was printing out a document. I put it in an envelope. When the person received it, it was a blank page with a black smear across it. I think we have to experiment with ways to make electronic ballots transmittable, accurate, and secure.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's one of the major things that's really holding us back right now. And I have to echo Jim's sentiments on VVSG 2.0 that I think really focused on election security to the detriment of elections accessibility by really ruling out some of the innovations that I think could make those systems more accessible in the future. And I think really limits us to the technology of today, including remote systems, which I know in the introduction of VVSG are stated as being out of scope for the VVSG, but then go on to describe it as being an electronically delivered ballot that is then printed and mailed. And if it's out of scope for the VVSG, I don't think it should have been defined in that document in a way that limits and excludes electronic return. So I think we really have to stop coming from a fear-based perspective when we talk about what electronics and digitization are doing to make voting more accessible, and really start to invest in research and development that embraces that and figures out how to make voting as secure as possible, but also as accessible as possible. And we cannot do that with the technology that we're using today. And I think it was really astute to point out even just systems that are more portable. That was one of my major concerns with curbside voting in 2020, is that we're currently using voting systems that don't allow you to necessarily vote privately and independently. Curbside, if we can't bring that system to you, right? So we're still asking voters to make a trade-off. I can vote curbside, but I lose my privacy and independence. In many places, I can vote by mail, but I lose that privacy and independence because I have to be able to print out a piece of paper that I can't read and verify, or I can't physically handle and mail back on my own. We're still asking voters with disabilities to make a trade-off and forfeit their federal right to a private and an independent vote to be able to cast their ballots. And we really have to think about how we're going to expand the technology we're using to change that going forward.
I would just add, God bless and thank the poll workers. But the point about an easily portable voting device is very important. The average poll worker in previous years, at least, was 72. And you give them this big, bulky machine, it's intimidating. Something that they can handle, that they're used to seeing, will, I think, help a lot of the problems that we still see where I know several organizations are completing surveys now. There are still many voters go into the polling place and the machine isn't turned on. The poll worker doesn't know how to turn it on. There aren't earphones. I think something modern, portable, smaller could address that problem.
Thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate them.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Chairman Holman, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some closing comments.
Thank you, Vice Chair Palmer, and thank you to the panelists. One thing I'd address somewhat quickly, I think, appreciate the feedback on the voluntary voting system guidelines. I think part of why we were so excited to finally move those forward is the enormous leap forward in technology, and also some pieces within the manuals, the testing and certification manual, that allows for pilots around component testing. We are hopeful that you'll see new companies come into the voting system marketplace, assistive technology companies that may not want to address the entirety of systems, but can focus on that interface for voters with disabilities. And so we hope that that will lead to a better voter experience going forward, but appreciate your comments and really want to thank all of the participants who took time from their busy schedule to join today.
Thank you for funding this study. It's very, very helpful.
You're welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge again the hard work of all the state and local election officials and federal partners that continue to work in this area. This is our last public EAC event in my year as chair of the EAC. So I'd like to thank my fellow commissioners and the EAC staff for making this last year not only successful, but so memorable. With the COVID-19 pandemic, it was certainly not the year I or anyone else anticipated. We had to change a lot of priorities pretty quick. And it was really a privilege to see the team come together and really the elections community come together to take on so many challenges of this pandemic and do such a fantastic job serving voters across the country as we heard about today. I'm so proud of the work that we've done and really want to acknowledge the EAC staff for all their work. The past year, we've had to conduct the work of the agency in this virtual environment like we're on today, but we've been able to do that without missing a beat. And this is because of our executive director, Mona Harrington, and the great team we have at the EAC. Next week, Vice Chairman Palmer will officially become Chairman Palmer, and Commissioner Hicks will serve as Vice Chairman for, I believe, a record-setting third time. So let me be the first to publicly congratulate them. And I look forward to this next year and the work we'll continue to do at the EAC. Thank you all for joining us. I don't have a gavel to virtually hand over. The closest I found was this stubby hammer. I will
They sent it
virtually
to
pass
me.
that to, oh, excellent. Then I will let you gavel us out, sir. We are adjourned.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.